has demonstrated more and more the fact that cyberspace can be an area of conflict where there's a physical effect and not merely an effect on the data. So this raises, I think, three legal issues on a global basis that we need to be attentive to as we respond to these new developments. One is the question of what are the norms that govern behavior on the internet as a matter of international law and international custom. And, we've got, obviously, in the physical world, the Geneva Convention and other rules of international law. The UN has put together, through the group of governmental experts, proposed rules for behaving on the internet as it relates to, for example, critical infrastructure. And I was pleased to be part of a Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace that propagated a number of norms, including one that would put the public core of the internet off limits to hacking or disruption by nation states. This was adopted later by the Paris Accord. The idea here is that, just as in the physical world, there ought to be international rules and norms that prevent people from disrupting those elements of the internet that we all rely upon as civilians for our economies and our health and our well-being, just as we don't bomb hospitals in the physical world. So the norms that are used to control cyberspace and to protect the critical infrastructure of the way the internet operates is one area I think that we are going to need to devote more attention to as a matter of international law. A second issue has to do with the effect of these new manifestations of threat on the internet on the laws of armed conflict. For example, when you have a cyber attack that results in physical impact, for example, ransomware that shuts down hospitals, as we've seen, for example, recently, I think Israel suffered attacks from Iran that shut down a healthcare system. Those are cyber attacks that can result in the loss of life. At that point, have we moved out of the realm of espionage and data conflict into the rule or the area of armed conflict, which can get a response not only in cyberspace, but in physical space as well. Defining the line at which cyber attacks cross over into armed conflict is, I think, again, another big challenge for international law going forward. A third element of that is the issue of attribution. As I mentioned earlier, the Colonial Pipeline attack was carried out by a Russian criminal group. But there has been intelligence that has been made public that the Russians from time to time enlist criminal groups to carry out state-sponsored attacks, or at a minimum, they close their eyes to criminal groups in order to allow them to be on call should the Russian intelligence service need them. So as we look at the issue of attribution and who is responsible for disruptive attacks, the question becomes, as a matter of law, what are the standards that we use to attribute? There are technical dimensions, which are relatively easy. But in addition to that, there is the question of responsibility. When does a state have the responsibility for actions carried out by groups operating within its borders? Do we have to show deliberate encouragement? Supposing there's simply a failure of the state to take affirmative steps to stop criminal behavior on the internet, is that sufficient to attribute responsibility to the nation state? And again, this is an area I think international law has to focus on as we move forward in the next few years. And finally, the issue of attribution and the legal obligation to affirmatively stop criminal behavior on the part of nation states is very relevant to the issue of self-defense. We have legal principles that allow us to take affirmative action and operational activity in foreign states to defend ourselves against attacks. And the question is, attribution and the legal obligation to stop criminal attacks have to be fundamental to the decision about whether self-defense and the principle of self-defense are applicable. So as we move forward in a world in which I think we're going to continue to see expanded commercial and personal activity on the internet, and one in which I think Russia and China, as two very sophisticated cyber actors, will continue to use the internet as tools for disinformation, for hybrid warfare, and for undermining the unity of effort on the part of Western nations. The question is, how will international law adapt to allow us to defend ourselves, to have a sensible and reasonable proposal for attribution, and to set legal guardrails and legal principles for activity in cyberspace as we have in physical space, so that we don't wind up with what we would call the Wild West on the internet, where anything goes, there's no restriction, and a nation state could undermine the fundamental infrastructure which we rely upon for our health, our communication, and all of our commercial and social activities. And I think this is going to be a challenge for international law and rule of law abiding nation states as we apply our legal principles to this new technological frontier. So thank you for holding this session, and I will sign off and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for your very interesting intervention. Our third speaker is Mr. Ali Sabry. He is the Minister of Justice and President of the Council of Justice of his country, Sri Lanka. You have the chair.
Thank you very much, fellow panelists and ladies and gentlemen. I think it's a great privilege for me to speak towards first of all, anything which has brought us to this pandemic is no one is safe until everyone is safe. So we could see people thought we can quickly vaccinate our family, our villages, our country, and the world will be safe. But it's quickly evolved that different variations started to come and mutations started to come, and as a result of which we all have seen things have gone out of proportion. That teaches a lesson. The lesson is we must treat everyone with respect. Unless your family is safe, unless your community is safe, unless your country or everybody is safe, or until your globe is safe, no one is safe. So if that is the case when it comes to national security, when it comes to prosperity, when it comes to inclusivity, that is why it is important. I think we need to look at that in that way. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, democracy will not work anywhere unless rule of law is strengthened. We have a constitution which provides clear goals for both executive, legislature, and the judiciary. Judiciary is protected by terms of reference and also duration of time, and they are being asked to independently deal with everything which comes up to them. As a result of which, despite challenges both post-terrorism and also due to pandemic, the judiciary has been strengthened. As a result of which, we have been able to strengthen the rule of law in our country. And the constitution is very clear. There is clear demarcation of duties between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. Other than the top members of the judiciary, which is often appointed in terms of the seniority, the entire judiciary is handled by a separate independent body called Judicial Service Commission. So the appointment, the term, the reference, everything is being done by them. As a result of which, we have seen that being giving very extraordinary and strong decisions one after the other, and keeping the Sri Lankans and their citizens and the freedom of thought straight and prioritized. However, we all know we went through a terrible war for about 30 years in Sri Lanka. We were fortunate to completely eradicate terrorism in the year 2009. Since then, we have been working to build consensus about the Sri Lankan different ethnicities, but it has been a challenge on and off. 2 years ago, we saw attack from extremism. 8 hotels were blown up in Sri Lanka in 2019. So as a result of which, we have to have this fine balance between fighting extremism, fighting terrorism, national security. When we do that, sometimes what happens is we, with or without our knowledge, some of the rights and freedoms get started to be attacked. As a result of which, we have to have a proper balance between the freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, and also about the national security. So we have our own law in Sri Lanka, anti-terror law called the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now people are starting to fight now, and they are asking further rights and judicial interventions. We are in the process of amending and moderating it so that to enable us to draw a balance between the people's right, freedom, and to fight extremism. Because it is also important, unless you fight and eradicate terrorism and extremism, no one is safe. In our country, we have to have so many disappearances and civil disobediences during the war. But since we have concluded the war, those things have drastically come down. So a peaceful situation and atmosphere provided anywhere will help everyone. Therefore, it is important that we realize that just like the pandemic taught us, unless we include everybody and our growth is inclusive, unless we allow everyone to be part of the larger society, whether it's a family, whether it's a neighbor, whether it's your country, whether the globe, no one is safe. So we have to understand that reality. So if you feel that only our country, our region, our family, our ethnicity is going to be safe at the expenses and the cost of the others, you are not going to reach them. So it's important that we learn from it, and I thought this is the major lesson that pandemic had taught us. Apart from that, it is also important that we all need to understand with this pandemic, national securities are also being compromised in view of the fact that more and more people have been asked to work on cyberspace, more and more people have been asked to work on internet. Some of the servers or things like that, what you have no control, and global giants have control. So that is why it is important that you and other international agencies should come in and protect data, protect security, protect privacy. And I was glad to see some of those thoughts were articulated by the speakers today at the initial session. So I thought it is time that we understand that humanity is one big family. We can't discriminate people based on region, language, culture, or nations. We all get together and make this planet a better place. In order to do that, democracy has to be sustained. In order to sustain the democracy, the rule of law has to be strengthened. In order to strengthen the rule of law, judiciary has to be strengthened. In order to strengthen the judiciary, you need to have proper constitutional provisions so that based on the whims and fancies of the politician, it cannot be tarnished or manipulated. So therefore, my single aim or urge from the fellow legal jurists from all over the world, fight for rule of law, fight for freedom of thought, fight for conscience, but you also have to understand there has to be balance between the national security and the people's right. But that balance has to be a delicate one. That has to be supervised by the rule of law. That has to be done through the intervention of the judiciary. Therefore, judiciary has to be strengthened if we are going to be having a meaningful rule of law that amounts to democracy. So democracy to thrive, rule of law has to be strengthened, rule of law to stay, it is important that judiciary has to be strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The importance of the rule of law as the basis for the control in a pandemic. Nuestro siguiente interviniente es don Ernesto Carrasco. Él es, como les he dicho, director ejecutivo de JAS Health y
very important person from Yes, is an expert regarding prices, public and private prices. Ernesto, please, um, you can start.
Muy buenos días, muchas gracias, estimada María Dolores, ministra.
Thank you very much, Maria Dolores. It's great being with you, the participants here. I want to start with this conversation having place here. Many of our economic, social, political problems, and also security problems, in particular national security, are linked to the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Also, this Congress is in take place in a context where the inflationary pressure is terrible regarding the states in Mexico that's derived from the supply chain that are affected due to the pandemic, and we cannot um, export some products that are very important. Migratory fluxes are big as a consequence of COVID-19, are risks to the national security, and have tested the governments to face these challenges, to confront human rights. This relevant thing was also the good schemes for vaccination is not only an access problems like we have in Latin America and Africa, and also the fact that things are not done. We've seen that in Europe that are not very well vaccinated. They got a new waves of COVID-19. There is a variable regarding some studies that is more contagious than the Delta. Some governments are uh, have gone through migration, sanitary problems to protect their population. We do not have then good information. Disinformation is also there. Regarding misinformation is relevant now. Actually, nowadays in this pandemic context, uh, are very much linked to those security information, lack of information, fake news, or obviously that is created, disseminated to cheat on people that are very well determined. These fake news are very common because it's difficult to manipulate and control, and it's hard to know who did it. Could be an organization, a person. There's exceptional cases that are identified in Latin America where we have uh, tracked down news coming from the States and Canada platform. We should got some sites that are used by individuals and stream right people, news that are very well translated in Portuguese and Spanish and spread from Twitter uh, by politicians, grew up on Facebook, digital media religious association like Doctors for the Truth. We know that these people wanted people vaccinated in Argentina, for instance. The goal of these people is very much different. It can be political reasons, religious reasons, motivations that are kind of blurry. So obviously, the consequences regarding disinformation is kind of clear. They polarize the opinions and they erode trust, generating mistrust for the authorities. So the misinformation is can be intention premeditated. It's intensified in crisis scenario. Um, that one we know from the pandemic we've suffered. This has meant that people are consuming the news very much and very often to understand what's happening. The variety of media uh, advances very fast, reaches many people, in contrast that good information given that is corroborated by the governments and some other institutions. We do not only use traditional channels, for instance, journals, magazines, radio, TV, in a very general way, Facebook, TikTok,
cadenas de mensajes, videos o imágenes. Este escenario ha contribuido a la
and everything. This scenario has
sobre
established
efectos del virus
everything regarding the public opinion, how could we treat the virus, for instance, and the measures that are taken from the government and the private scenario to attend these people and its consequence. Pandemics and emerging sicknesses are just right there and constitute risks. Disinformation or misinformation is very bad to counterattack these risks and control them. That is also vulnerable for states, governments, and citizens as well. It's something very unstable for them in this context, which is not very good. Citizens can find fake news everywhere,
como sucedió
like
con el
we've
dióxido
seen
de
in
cloro
Mexico
o en
with
el penicilina
chlorine dioxide
o en el suplemento mineral
ivermectin in this mineral
sucedió en Colombia
supplement
y
that
sucedió
was
en Bolivia.
miraculous, for instance, in Argentina and Peru and
Se
Bolivia.
recomienda el uso de
They
cubrebocas o
offered
medidas que incrementan el temor por la contaminación
risks regarding the mask and the way we should behave regarding vaccines that are being applied, and also the ones that have not been approved by the OMS and some institutions that are in the States, in Canada, Sinovac,
que se están
some
aplicando.
examples that are in some countries in Latin America. Well, in this world regarding COVID-19 is very relevant to get a measure regarding fake news. We understand that it constitutes a vital element to get national security in some countries. The measures against fake news are just right there. We're talking about the security of states and companies, and citizens have to know about pandemic. That's very relevant and comes informative conscience. I want to finish that saying that this initiative, backed up by some actors, also society, businessmen, and also consulting groups, um, we're going to strengthen the upcoming crisis and also pandemic. And we have to then think about that and try to counterattack fake news.
Gracias, Ernesto. Muchas gracias por
Thank you very much, Ernesto. It was very relevant. Uh, let's see the implications. We're going to talk about that.
al señor Rabinovich.
Mr. Rabinovich is just right here.
Sí, pues le damos paso, por favor.
We
Bueno, llevamos una mesa muy accidentada, ¿eh? Ya lo siento y pido disculpas a todos porque las conexiones a veces no funcionan como deberían funcionar y también los panelistas que están al otro lado pasan sus nervios. Vamos a intentar conectarnos y si no fuera posible lo haríamos con... ¿Sí? Pues adelante. Mr. Rabinovich, be very welcome. Thank you. No se le escucha bien. ¿Ok? No se le escucha.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Good. I
Mr. Chertoff, in a very interesting way, spoke to us about some of the more recent challenges to national security and to the legal system through cyber war, and other very recent developments. I would like to take us back into a more classic way of international relations and geopolitics, and look at the way in which the current international system has a very hard time trying to use legal norms and legal institutions in order to regulate traditional classic challenges to national security motivated by national interest, balance of power, and so forth. And I would like to speak about two interlinked parts of the global system: Europe, it's NATO and the EU, and the Middle East. Looking at the two current most significant challenges to security in Europe, that is to say, Russian policy and the crisis of immigration into Europe. As we are speaking, the issue of the threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine is on the agenda. And of course, tragically, we have been watching refugees on the Belarusian Polish border freezing, and even poorer refugees drowning to death in the La Manche Channel, separating Great Britain from France. And I unfortunately have to put forth the argument that the international system, NATO, the European Union, have no tools or no legal tools to deal with these issues. They revert to balance of power, national interest, and other familiar components of international relations. I mentioned two interlinked parts of the globe: the Middle East, where I live, and in the politics of which I specialize, is the source of some of these issues, or the arena in which some of the same actors play. I mentioned Russia before, and the threat of invasion of Ukraine. Of course, we have all internalized the facto that the Crimea had been overtaken by Russia, and that Russian irregulars fighting or using violence in eastern Ukraine. Russian so-called private militias, the Wagner militia, is active in the Middle East, active in Libya, and in other trouble spots of the Middle East, including Syria. Russia itself deployed in Syria. It is there, of course, under the so-called legal invitation of the sovereign government, but we all know that the legal basis on which the government of Syria is resting is very, very slim. A government that had used chemical weapons against its own population can hardly be called legitimate. And of course, many of the refugees that have created a huge problem in European stability in 2015 are threatening to undermine European stability and the very existence of the EU. The poor people who are freezing on the Belarusian-Polish border mostly come from Iraq. They are Iraqi refugees, and this takes us to part of the origin of the problem. That is the collapse of several of the states of the Middle East. Iraq, where many of these refugees come from. Syria, where the civil war is over, but the crisis is not. The 5 million Syrian refugees outside their own countries. Lebanon, where a paramilitary organization sustained by Iran is stronger than the government. Libya, that I have mentioned. Sudan, which has just witnessed yet another coup. Yemen, where an atrocious civil war is taking place. They all are the outcome of the collapse of several of the states in the region. there's really no legal constitutional framework for managing what unfortunately have become failed states. What it exports to Europe and some respects to other parts of the world are refugees and sometimes terrorists, most recently in the Daesh, ISIS version of things. Now, we cannot be naive about it. There's not going to be a legal system or a set of legal institutions that will resolve these issues. They will have to be resolved by policies and politics. But we, people who believe in the rule of law, need to try to put up legal institutions and legal norms in order not to solve the problem, but at least to accommodate them, to limit them, to try to limit part of them into legal channels. And that I would like to submit to you is one of the most important challenges that the global system is facing nowadays. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rabinovich, and also for your patience. Thank you very much. So our last speaker is Mr. Giampaolo Di Paola.
Yes, I'm here.
Paolo.
Do you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you. We can't see you. Oh, right. Go ahead, Giampaolo.
Okay. Good morning. Well, many of the points I will touch has already been somehow touched by the previous speaker, but fundamentally, my point is that we are on the brink of a dramatic shift in the security landscape, because we are moving from a system which was somehow shaped by the West, shaped by the United States in particular. It was a multilateral liberal order scenario based on the international rule of law. This system is challenged by the rise of new autocratic power, like China, and certainly by Russia, but not only them. And so we are entering in a phase of a power competition. And it is not just a competition for power in the geostrategical sense. It's a competition for the vision of the world. A vision that, according to Biden, both one side the alliance of democracies and on the other side illiberal realities. That is what we are entering into. And the point is that why we are entering this competition, the challenges and that we are faced with transcend the two sides, the two competitors, because they are global. And that is the point. We are living in a situation of great competition, but the challenges transcend competition. And therefore, that is a big issue, because this challenge would require be global in nature. The pandemic is one of them, climate change is another one, disruptive technology is another one. These challenges would require an overall approach by the two sides, and why they compete, that is the problem. Fundamentally, I see 5 trends which are characteristic of the period we're getting into. The first one, as I said before, the global challenges. Climate change, pandemia, the emergency of today, but probably we will see in the future other pandemia coming through. Migration, massive migration, which what we are seeing today probably is peanuts in what might happen in the near future, because of this global challenge that will face people, will push people to move out of the places toward other places. The second is a fragmentation. On one side, we are living in a world of hyperconnectivity. We are more and more connected. Any second we are connected with everybody everywhere. But why the hyperconnectivity is improving the life condition of many, on the other side, there is a strong fragmentation inside individual state, inside society, inside community. The third, this fragmentation is causing a third trend, and disequilibrium, a lack of equilibrium, a lack of balance between the needs, what the people want, what the people demand, and the capacity of the states, of the international organization, of the community, the one in charge, let's say, to respond to this requirement. So therefore, this unbalance is causing a greater contestation. We see everywhere, every moment, anytime, any place, people getting in the street. This has been in Hong Kong, in Bogota, in Rio, in Brussels, in London, in Glasgow, recently, where the people, the green people under the leadership of Greta Thunberg getting in the street and saying, no, you government, you're not doing anything serious. You're only doing blah, blah, blah against the climate change. Or the Novax movement, which are getting in the street and challenging the government and what we're trying to do to face the pandemic. So increased contestation. So the conclusion is that in the face of all these trends, we need to adapt. We need to adapt. That means we will need to understand that we have to adapt to a new vision of a collective interest to reduce these imbalances inside the state, inside the community, and among in the international community, among the states. And who will be able to adapt better, he will be the winner. And the point is, will be the democracies, will be the liberal democracies, which will be able to adapt better, or will be the autocracies, which are challenging the democracy and saying, no, we are the system of the future, not you. You, the liberal democracy, you are the loser. So this is the big challenge, the big fight, the big competition for the future. Who will be able to adapt better to this new challenge? Speaking of democracy, speaking of those who belong to these alliances of democracy, certainly NATO, the Atlantic Alliance, and the European Union belong to this camp. And these two organizations are trying also to adapt themselves. And they are trying to do, pushing forward a new idea. NATO is working to a new strategic concept, which will be approved, expected to be approved in Madrid the next June. And a new NATO will look what would be the key point of the new strategic concept. I mean, I'm just guessing, of course, but I base this on what the Secretary General has anticipated so far. NATO will need to remain strong militarily, but will have to have much stronger capacity because China and Russia are really getting very tough opponents. NATO must become more political organization, which are more cohesive political, a more political alliance, not only a military one. NATO, although it's a regional organization, needs to have a global perspective. So we need a much broader NATO because the challenges which are facing us are global, and therefore we need a more broader perspective. And therefore, here comes the issue of China and what China implication will have for the security of the alliance. And that is a key point. The European will have to sustain, to support a big burden, a greater burden than up to now, because the United States are very much engaged in the Pacific in the competition with China. So the European will have to do much more of their part in Europe to face the challenge in the European field. The European side, so we need a stronger strategic partnership between NATO and the European Union. And the European Union wants on its part to become a more relevant global player. There is a lot of talking about European strategic autonomy, whatever that means. There is a debate on this, but fundamentally means that the European Union have to bear greater responsibility in geostrategy and geopolitics. And for doing that, they need also to have a security dimension and defense dimension, which is considerable. So they will have to invest more on that. The strategic concept compass is the exercise the European Union has launched to define its ambition in the field of security. The challenge is to bring into harmony the strategic compass and the strategic concept by NATO and European Union, to bring them in harmony so that we have a reinforced strategic bond, because a reinforced transatlantic bond is the best guarantee for our Western security, but also for defend the rule of law domestically and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giampaolo. Tenemos unos minutos porque hemos empezado con retraso para, si quieren hacer alguna pregunta a los panelistas. Yo pediría, puesto que el audio no es muy bueno, que sea los que tenemos la suerte de tener aquí en vivo. Contamos con un primer ministro que ha sido un orgullo para su país y para su país de origen también, Manuel Valls, con el actual ministro de Justicia de Sri Lanka y con un profesional en temas de seguridad de primer nivel. ¿Alguno de ustedes quiere formular alguna cuestión? Voy a dar 2 palabras y luego haremos el resumen, si no parece mal. Allí vamos a pasar un micrófono.
We're going to let someone use the microphone right now to solve the doubts. Yeah, hello, thank you very much for your intervention. It was fantastic. I want to ask a couple of things to Manuel Valls. Well, something you said regarding the importance of differentiating the crisis, compare that to the state of exception, the terrorist attacks to France. That was very much meant a state of exception. It's very coherent to say that it's very subjective regarding the exception. The Colombian case is regarding the pensional funds. For some other states have tried to get this exemption stayed regarding the pension funds. That's structural. That's what the authority said, and it doesn't have to go through those pages. Well, regarding the context previously mentioned, the data analysis, metadata, and everything regarding this modern way of understanding modern administration, does that help to eliminate the subjective component to define state of exception or exception? Don't you think that a governor that has not been through all the controls of the states, for instance, in Colombia, and the law that it's dictated by the Constitution and the control from the Constitutional Court, besides the political judgment, they have to then contemplate sanctions to have, trying to use this exception moment of rule in an aspect that does not require that, because it's very subjective. I can say that the state of exception that exists in Carta Magna and some constitutions that exists very well, but is not very well used in France, is not, for instance, in France before 2015, the state of exception to understand terrorist attack and counterattack, and also this pandemic we're facing right now, that weakens this state of exception, and we think that these individual freedoms, we are the guarantors of all that. Using this emergency state cannot be an act, cannot have a vice there. We have to find equilibrium among security and liberty, so that the democratic systems that are very much questioned in several ways should not be affected. The state of right should offer a good answer, but very frank. In the European Union, some voices were raised before the sanitary problems. They were talking about all the flaws regarding that. The sanitary crisis in the European Union have added up to a very tense environment in America. In Latin America, we face that very often. In Europe, I'm talking about Europe, is something that's very important to underline the value of our systems, and we need to defend them regarding obviously misinformation, fake news. We're talking about the law, the state shouldn't be above all that. It's very important to support the state of law and the democratic process. So we have to come out this state of exception, and we have to think more about the regional responsibility of the UN. We have to think about counterattacking the crisis regarding national issues. We have to cooperate, obviously, among each other, and it's also the capacity to respond very adequately to these crises. Hello, I'm Sebastián López Ambello. Thank you for being here. We're going to talk. Thanks for your wisdom. It's a very small question. We have the risks there and regarding national security that are caused by this social catastrophe. Do you consider, it's for Manuel Valls, do you consider that there is a link between those materialized risks in regarding national security in a global way and the loss of juridic security due to the state of and the odd exemption that we see? The executive uh, can put on the table a decree, and obviously everything is a law like that. It is very disruptive regarding the law. Is there a link with the security crisis we're facing now? That's all the panelists have that through their experiences in Colombia. They all have, their answers. From the pandemic was very intense. We had a transparency problem in the beginning of the pandemic. So the incapacity of gathering good information, obviously that's, I'm talking about China. We can talk about security, we can talk about terrorism. Information to the public is really relevant regarding the state of the art. The voice of the United Nations wants to be listened, and the proliferation channels are just there with different information regarding the vaccines, and the distribution of them is relevant. That happens very often in Africa. Only the 6% of its population is totally vaccinated. The lack of preparation by the states, due to that, there's this mass scarcity and some other threats regarding sanitary tools. Why do I say that? Well, this is an international crisis we never saw, but now all the continents are affected. we have to think what level we want to respond, or we want to respond. This, it's a state. It's an answer from the state of law, and that happens in the Carta Magna. We have to think about it internationally. We have to think about strategy. How can we respond to that in a very sanitary way? It's it's very important regarding the economic part. Europe and in some other continents, we were very dependent on some other continents. That's why we have financial difficulties. Obviously, the respect of everything regarding that is very relevant, but this crisis has given us more questions, more difficulties. We have to be capable of facing those difficulties, because tomorrow there's a variable regarding the virus. We will have problems, and that can question the economic crisis and the governmental crisis. It can challenge our own democratic systems.
Yo quisiera concluir,
I
pero tengo
think
que concluir
I have to
esta
conclude now.
siguiente y no voy a poderles dar más la palabra. Tenemos que pasar a la siguiente.
We have to
Pero quiero
go
resumir todo lo que aquí se ha hablado.
and say everything we wanted to say. Well, it is very, very clear that
De la importancia del rule
the
of law, del Estado de
capacity of the rule of law is really, really important. We are fighting back. We're talking about a pandemic. Uh,
tragedia que era el terrorismo.
we know terrorism very, very well. We're talking about the way we proceed, and some others, this importance of the state of right. The tool is, this is a very important tool to fight and to get the things done. What happens? Well, we're seeing aggressions towards democracy in states, cybernetic attacks, the countries that disagree with the state of right, uh, individual liberties are not there. Well, so the attacks are coming in a very different way. We're not talking about antique things. Uh, Now we have different tools, unconventional tools. So the state of right has to be also ready to face these attacks. Well, Manuel Valls talking about this Sri Lanka, uh, Giampaolo, Mr. Rabinovich, regarding Russia, Crimea, that's very, very important for geostrategy. We're talking about how we should defend themselves from the Occidental values. We're talking about values created in the western part of the world. That's changed very much. The OTAN has to adapt themselves, the European Union too, the Latin American organizations, and some other actors that were involved. Well, they have to adapt themselves to new schemes to defend our values and democracy, and they were attacked in a very unconventional way, and we let them in because our democracies are not very well structured. When we talk about that, when we defend the rule of law, we have to put on the table the way we're going to defend ourselves. This is not normal. Everything, being able to find the answers, the democracy is going to win. And if we do not find the answers, our enemies will. We have to be there. This Congress is very, very important, but we have to work from home. Thank you very much. speakers.
Y buenos días aquí en Barranquilla. Gracias.